Caleb Olson, great to have you back on the Singletrack Podcast, and great to see you safely back in Suncrest. I can see, I think, is it Box Elder in the background or Lone Peak?
Box Elder on this side, Lone Peak on this side.
How are you feeling, man? It's 7:30 a.m. Friday, Tuesday, February 25th. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling pretty good. It's nice to be home. I've been away for a couple of weeks now, and feels good to be back. We've been texting since like 4 a.m. because we're both super jet lagged and on weird sleep schedules. So still a bit tired, but I'm feeling good.
For the audience, for people that don't know, we had ambitions to record this conversation in the Amsterdam airport. I think it was a day and a half ago. And we had this weird layover where our flight from Gran Canaria got into Amsterdam around midnight. And then our next flight didn't take off until 8 a.m. And I'm more so saying this because I'm curious if either you or anyone in the audience knows the answer. But basically, we arrive and we think that we're going to be able to basically shuttle to the Delta Lounge or some cool place to record. And I think we're all so tired that we get to baggage claim because we have to go grab some of the bags that didn't make it for the full thing to Salt Lake. And we all just there's like 6 of us there. And we're like, I think we just got locked out of the airport and we're stuck in these hallways for the next 8 hours. What do we do? Did you figure out like what we could have done better?
I don't think we could have done anything better. I think that's what we had to do because you have to get your bag to go through customs, and like the lounge stuff that we wanted access to wasn't even in the part where we exited the plane, and like you have to leave the like do not re-enter gate to go get your bag. So I think we were just stuck, but we ended up at a Burger King at like 11:30 p.m. just eating Whoppers and trying to find a spot to sit down for 6 hours until security opened back up so we could get back into the airport.
And I just don't think the ambiance was quite right. And like you said, we might have just been fading intellectually. Everything was sort of off. And so we're doing it remote. All right, you're the first American man to win at Transgrancanaria. I know Debo has podium tiered. Tyler Green has also podium tiered, to name a few. On the women's side, Courtney DeWalters won it. Caitlin Gerbins won it. But like you finally broke the tape. You're a winner here. And you've done an awesome job, I think, of reflecting on a lot of this race, both in the lead up and sort of the aftermath on Substack. We'll link to that in the show notes. But the first place that I want to dive in happens before the race. And one of the big guns, one of your main competitors, Tom Evans, withdraws about a week before the race. And I'm curious to know, like, when you saw that news, when you read that news, what was your initial reaction?
I was definitely a little disappointed. I have wanted to race Tom for a bit, and like something kind of similar, kind of different happened at Cape Town where he withdrew a few days before. I think it would have been a really fun dynamic to see him and Jon kind of working with each other, because I think Jon was also really excited to race him, and like, I don't know, I think part of me was like excited to race him. Also, part of me was thinking like, okay, cool, I possibly just moved up one spot in the order because Tom's really good. There's a good chance he could have gotten me. But also, now that I know how that race went, I really wish he had been there, because I don't think there's that many people that could have stuck with me with the kind of day that I had that day. So I think it would have been really great. But yeah.
And one of the other things that you wrote, and I think it was one of your pre-race Substacks, you're kind of looking at the field, Tom included, and you're sort of hoping that it's Tom and Jon that are thinking about each other, and they're the primary threats, and maybe you're an afterthought, which I found fascinating. Like, you were writing it, at least in my view, as if you're still at this stage in the sport where maybe you're a relative unknown, maybe you're being overlooked. Is that truly how you felt heading in?
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I mean, like, we'll get their like elite lead up posts or whatever. Transgrancanaria does like these hype videos for like their top contenders. They didn't like, I didn't have one. That's fine. Like, they just do the top few in their ranking system, and that was mostly Tom and Jon. And so I think like that's where the attention is. And honestly, I kind of like that. Like, let them get the attention, let them have the pressure sitting on them all race week. And I like kind of, I don't know, lurking out of sight and watching them do their thing, and then just sitting back there and trying to work my way up near them. But yeah, I guess that's all I've got to say about that.
How do you think Tom would have changed race dynamics? Do you feel like he's a different runner than Jon or Josh, even yourself? Like in the post you mentioned, I'm going to kind of, even in this race, I'm going to sit back a little bit. I'm going to keep them in sight, but I think they're going to kind of do damage. So talk about that.
I've never raced Tom, so I guess I don't know like firsthand, but just from like I chatted with Anthony before, who's raced him at Black Canyon and Western, and like I do think he's a smart guy. Like he wouldn't have gone out too hot. He knows what he can handle. He's got a ton of experience. So does Jon, and I think those guys would have like set a good pace, but also been smart with it. And so I would have trusted that like as long as I'm behind them, I'm not going too fast, which historically has been like my main concern is like I don't want to overextend myself too early on. And if you're following along with the race, like you saw, that's not what happened. I actually ended up taking the lead pretty early on, and I don't really usually ever do that. And I think if Tom had been there, I might not have, because I would have trusted that those guys were setting a good pace.
Wow.
But with how it was, I honestly kind of felt like we were not going super fast at the beginning, and like it wasn't that crazy to take the lead and push the pace a little.
So you feel like you were able to dictate purely because of race dynamics and not because there was some breakthrough in training or mindset shift where it's like I'm ready to lead these types of races?
I didn't have the feeling of I'm ready to lead these types of races, but I maybe will now more, because I'm like, that was the first race where I've really done that. So I'm starting to like see the fun in it and benefit of it and like get a little more confident. But I do think it's a combination of those factors. Like I think without feeling fit from great training, I wouldn't have felt the confidence to do that.
Yeah. In that post again, you said, my best guess is that it's going to take a 13:10 to 13:20-ish effort to win TGC. Mm-hmm. And I guess I'm curious, if someone had told you, or if you had the idea up front that it was going to take 12:20 or faster, would you have felt like physically you had what it took, or did it take being in that race and letting things play out to have this realization that you can be there?
It's so hard to get your head around like what that means to run 12 something on that course. Like you just don't, like I didn't see the entire course before. I did 2 runs on the course and saw maybe like 20 miles of it or something like that. But I think if you told me it would have taken a 12:20, I would have made my splits for 12:20 and hoped that it worked, because I don't really have like a great reference of how fast that is. But I do think like historically shooting for 13:10-ish made sense. Like maybe this course was 10 to 20 minutes faster than last year's course, let's say. But last year's winner was in the 13:20s. So I figured like bump it down a little bit and then assume that each year is going to be faster than the last. So like subtract a little more and then make splits for that. And it turns out like I was never pushing, trying to hit certain splits going into different aid stations. It was more just my guess of when I would hit them, not targets really. But I eventually got to the spot where I was way ahead on those, and that was fine too. I wasn't too focused on the splits at that point, I guess.
Was this the first race heading in that you've ever felt you could win? Like not the smaller races, but these sort of like bigger stage races like the Cape Towns, the CCCs, Westerns. Was this the first one that you felt like there was a strong possibility?
I think so. Yeah, I think even like in 2023, like Grindstone and Sonoma were maybe my best ones. And neither of those, like Grindstone I did win, but I didn't go into it thinking that I was going to necessarily. And I don't think I did any big race last year where I thought that I could. So yeah, I think this might have been the first one where I was like, I've got like a maybe greater than 25% chance of actually winning this thing.
What needed to be true for that shift to happen? Like what was different heading into this race versus like a Grindstone or even a Cape Town?
I think confidence from Western states last year was part of it. I think having a coach and having really focused styled training. I've never worked so hard in a training block as this one. And I just felt like I did every single little thing that I possibly could have done to prepare for this race. And like, unless someone else is just genetically better than me, which happens, and I'm sure some people are, but unless they're genetically better, like they're probably not training harder or doing all the little things better than me. So I've got as good of a chance as they do.
Let's get into that. Let's talk about, because you started working with Jack Kuenzle at the beginning of this block. Can you just bring us back to even like how you met and how he comes on your radar and you start to think like this could be a good investment?
Yeah, I have followed Jack for a while, like through social media, because he goes after a lot of high alpine mountaineering style FKTs and just does a lot of cool routes. And he's like, my impression of him is definitely, it, it actually hasn't changed much knowing him better now, but it's that he's kind of a crazy dude in like the best way, but like really obsessive, really just gets hyper focused on an objective and then does every single little thing in his power to maximize his perfect day on that objective. And I figured, I mean, I talked to a variety of coaches. I was looking for some specific things, and Jack checked the most boxes out of everybody that I talked to. He was also local for the winter while we were doing this training block, and that was really nice to be able to meet up with him in person, chat together, and like he knew all the trail conditions on any given day, so he could adjust my training plan and say like, oh, it just snowed 2 feet last night, don't do grandeur, hop on this trail instead. And that kind of information is really valuable. But I think connected, and I liked his style when we met up, and it seemed like it would be worth giving it a shot.
You know that whenever you're reading a book, I always ask you what your takeaways are. And I got to ask here, like with Jack, now that you've been working together for a few months, what do you think his influence has been on you? Like, have you adopted some of his obsession for like specific objectives and not looking too far forward?
Yeah, I think I have. I don't think I'm at his level in that way, but I do think that I feel like the biggest influence probably is like repetition of specific activities week over week and seeing progress and increasing like one variable at a time through those activities. So like previously, before having a coach, I hadn't done many focused workouts, and now there's a very clear like template that Jack follows that we use Training Peaks. And so I can look at like, all right, this week I've got this interval workout on Tuesday, I've got this hill workout on Thursday. The following week I've got those exact same workouts, but I'm adding one more interval, or I'm tweaking one little thing with each one of those that makes it slightly harder, slightly higher training load. And I'm adapting, and I'm able to handle it even when the previous week it felt like that was the most I could possibly handle. The next week I can do a little more. And stacking those up for 2-3 months, you eventually get to the point at the end of the 3 months where you never could have imagined that you did that, or you'd be able to do that at the beginning of the block.
I know for you, there has to be at least some fun in the equation to get out the door, but maybe the trade-off here is just like what you need to do, like just like brass tacks to be competitive in this race versus like, I want to go out and just like enjoy the mountains. Was that a difficult trade-off for you, like in this block, or have you kind of come around to seeing the light on just doing the work necessary?
I'm definitely more on the do the work necessary side now than I ever have been. I've done less fun, cool adventures. Garrett always gives me a hard time and says I miss the old Caleb because I'm not out there stumbling through bushes with him for like 8 hours, and I'm not skiing quite as much as I used to. But I do think I still have kind of stuck to my guns. Like one of Jack and I's main, not conflicts, but like debates over time is it'll snow and he'll tell me like, hop on the treadmill, conditions aren't that great, like do an incline treadmill workout. And that's one where I've stuck to my guns and gotten outside pretty much every time that's come up. I've done very few indoor activities. So that's my way of keeping the fun in it a bit. I just cannot do treadmills, but yeah.
If we're being totally honest though, do you feel like the sad reality is that if you want to truly maximize everything in the sport, there are a lot of days where you do have to get on that treadmill at the climbing gym and just like grind it out?
I don't think so. I think the mental toll that takes of just absolutely ruining running for you does not balance out for whatever physical gain you get out of it. I'd rather just do a different workout that day. And like, if it's not in the cards to get up something steep because it's dumping snow, then switch over and do a road tempo or something. I don't know. Like, I think there's almost always ways that you can avoid the terribleness of the treadmill.
What else was new, or maybe the word is exotic for you in this block? Like what else was he encouraging you or having you do on specific runs or outside of runs? That was an adaptation.
We did some focused work on like heat adaptations beyond just sauna that I hadn't done before, like more active stimulus with heat. We did some weighted workouts and like gradually increased weight on hiking and running stuff. We did short intervals, like 12-second reps uphill that I hadn't done before, that I think was more of like a neurological stimulus, like trying to learn how to fire muscles faster and build strength. I did strength training, which I hadn't really done much of before. There were a bunch of things.
Tell people about the weighted vest thing. That might be new to a lot of people.
I actually didn't end up using a weighted vest that often because the weighted vest went along with the treadmill, which I only got myself to do like once because you don't really want to have to wear the vest back downhill. So I ended up doing more like with a backpack full of gallons of water, and then that way you can dump the water out at the top and come down with no weight. But yeah, there were some some tough days out there on West Granger, just hauling water up the hill.
And then on the heat adaptation front, are you talking about like heat suit training, like you're going on runs in 8 layers of clothing?
Yeah, less running, more like indoor. I don't mind the bike trainer that much if it's short, so that sort of thing. But yeah, just dumping sweat.
Okay, interesting. And then talk about like your communication with him post race. Like, what does he say to you? What do you say to him? Get some insight there.
I texted him a few hours after and I said, dude, I think whatever we're doing, it's working. And he was stoked for me. He said, he said great job and stuff. And basically we're going to meet up tomorrow, actually, or not meet up, but we're going to hop on a call tomorrow and do some debriefing because there were things in the race where I felt great. And there were some things where I felt like I could focus on that for training for future races that are like this. And, probably still have a lot of room to improve in those things.
Where are those improvements, or where are the question marks for you?
I think the biggest thing that stuck out was that Transgrancanaria was surprisingly sort of runnable. Like there's a lot of uphill, but it was a lot of that like less than 600 or 700 feet per mile grade where you can still kind of jog it. And I felt great on that stuff. But then there were also punchy little climbs where it goes up to grades of over like 1,000 feet per mile.
Yeah.
That they're not super long, but that's where I noticed that Jon and Josh were able to put some gap on me. And I felt like my hiking was less efficient than theirs. And like I have some room to grow in hiking. And that'll be important for if I end up like making the world's team or doing other steeper courses later this year, I'm going to need to get better at hiking.
Are you going to, this reminds me, are you going to unlock any of the Strava files from this block, or are you forever Strava dim for this Transgrancanaria?
Like retroactively go back and
yeah.
I don't even know. That seems like a pain to go back and do that for each one. But there's a decent amount up there. I'd say like somewhere in the range of like 40 to 70% is on Strava, depending on the week. But there's some where I got some crowns that I probably want to show off that I'll unlock at some point. I just haven't taken the time yet to go back and refine those activities.
Gotcha. Okay, that was a good detour. I want to come back to the beginning of the race. If you go to your latest Substack, which I think, by the way, is a cool format of you write something in advance, and then as soon as the gun goes off, there's like that auto-publish feature on Substack. But you kind of skip ahead. You overlook a lot of the first 47 miles, and I think there is some interesting stuff to discuss there. And I think one of the questions I have for you is, okay, you've made this decision to be a front runner. You're going to dictate a lot of the race. This is a new arena. So like when you're thinking about, getting through a Rucus at mile 12 or Taror at mile 20, just those early miles, the first 50K, how do you stay motivated? Like, what gives you like the impetus to keep staying sort of courageous and not falling back? Because as someone who was behind you maybe 10 or 20 minutes early and then increasingly, hours behind you, I saw a lot of people who were in that pack for the first 3 miles and they were like, that's not me, and they're back. So talk about how you're able to maintain.
Yeah. So at the beginning, I mean, maybe for like the first 2 miles or so, I kind of stayed with the pack, sitting with everybody in the front. And then it was just feeling good and I was flowing. So I kept going at what felt like a decent pace and looked back and I had some daylight between me and the people behind me. So I really, the thought was just like, why is nobody coming? Like, are they just going to let me have this that easy? And the trails were pretty technical in the beginning. Like you're going through some kind of washy riverbeds and it's dark and you're stumbling around a little. So I thought like maybe I'm just good at these like little bouldery run, like, I don't know, creek bed kind of running. And maybe they're all slower than that or than me on that kind of stuff. So they'll catch back up when it turns back into a real trail. But that didn't happen. And I got through like the first aid station and I had maybe a minute or two on the rest of the pack. And I think I finally realized like, okay, I am actually working a lot harder than it feels like I'm working. Like I feel great, but I know that I can't maintain this heart rate for 13 hours or however long this is going to take. So I should probably start getting into a rhythm where I can hold it all day. And I dialed it back going into the first crew aid station. And I could see people gaining behind me and see the pack catching up. And I made peace with that pretty quickly. I was like, okay, it'll be fun to not run by myself for 79 miles anyway. I don't mind packing up with these guys. And I think everybody regrouped at that first crew aid station.
How early on did it become that ultimate pack of you, Jon, and Josh Wade until, fairly late in the race?
I mean, I saw a video of us all running down the beach at the start line, and there was one or two guys who went out super fast that eventually like dropped out or fell way back. But other than those guys, it was me, Jon, and Josh on the beach from the very beginning. And there were times where we got separated, but when we really regrouped and it was like solidly the three of us plus a couple Spanish people was from that first crew aid station. So like mile 12?
Yeah.
Oh, actually, no. Sorry, it was the second crew aid station. It was like mile 20.
Terror, yeah.
Yeah. From there on out, mile 20 on, we were all pretty close together.
I was personally, I mean, you kind of said it already. I was looking back, I was shocked that it ended up becoming a 3-person race that early. Not only that, but then for how long you guys held together until, the early 50s. That was, I mean, both of those factors were, I don't know if you have any thoughts there, but those dynamics were shocking to me.
There were two other people, I think Spanish guys, who had stuck on us until that descent down to El Hornillo, like mile 32-ish. And then you kind of climb for a second up to that aid station. And from there on out, I saw their headlamps falling back and we didn't see them again. So it was really from mile 32 to 45 or so that the three of us were together. And then Jon took a little longer coming out of that mile 45 aid station. And from then on out until mile 52, I think it was just me and Josh. But it was really fun. Like that, it's a crazy dynamic to just have 3 people in a pack like that who are all, it felt like fairly, I mean, I felt like most of us were working pretty evenly hard. Like the effort seemed like it could go in any direction. And there wasn't a clear person who was standing out as they're just hanging out here and they can dust us whenever they want. But it was also fun to like actually chat and have conversation going with those guys because like Jon Albon is like an icon in the sport. Like he's so good. So to just be chatting with him like equals kind of at like mile 40 of this race. There was a funny moment where I looked down at my watch and I saw like 41, 42 miles and like 15,000 feet of gain. And we were at like, I don't remember the exact time right now, but it was probably around 8 hours. And Jon had just been talking about Transvolcania, and I knew that that was like about the stats of Transvolcania, and I was like, dude, what? That's like a winning time at Transvolcania. I'm kind of like hitting it right now. Like we're kind of crushing this. And he's like, oh yeah, man. Like he said after we've totally raced that like an 80K and then just had to hold on for another 50K after. But it was really fun to have that sort of like conversation and respect with those guys and know that everybody's trying to break each other, but also is just having fun and hanging out sort of. It was cool.
It seems like that reminds me, it seems like the only way to have success in 2025 now is to set a massive course record at any of these given races. Like that's just the table stakes. And you were equivalent to that 40 miles into Transgrancanaria for a Transvolcania experience. For people that don't know Josh Wade, because you were with him for so long, can you talk about your read on him, like what you saw as his skill set, his personality, any interesting moments with him?
Yeah, he's the nicest guy ever. Like that was the main thing that stood out was he was just stoked to be up there. He had done it the previous year and I think he'd come in like 7th or 8th and he was out there to push hard this year. He said he wanted a battle and he definitely got one. I think he was stoked to be up in the front and loved like controlling the pace. So he was actually the one making the most moves, like throwing in pushes. He's a strong hiker, but then he would also go off and like when he was running, it was a faster run than I was doing or than Jon was doing. So he would take off running and Jon and I would kind of look at each other and Jon made some comment about like, he'll come back. And he would then after that push, like hike to recover for a bit, we'd catch back up, regroup, and then it would just repeat itself. And that happened for hours. So I mean, he clearly wanted to push everybody, and I think none of us would have gone nearly as fast without that sort of effort because it would have been really easy to just settle down into a pace and chill. But there was nonstop like moves going on that everybody had to match if you didn't want to get dropped.
Same question for Jon. Now that you've had this experience racing with him, like again, I guess it's now Western states and here. What have you learned about Jon? Like, what do you see as his skill sets? Like, how is he contributing to that race dynamic?
He put a lot of pressure on later in the race. Like, I think that I had gotten to the point where I was confident that I had Josh. I was like listening to his breathing and he just sounded like he was working a lot harder than me. And I kind of figured like, okay, I feel confident now with Josh. Jon had dropped back, but was never really out of the equation. He had just taken a couple minutes to get nutrition dialed and figure out some stomach issues, I think, at an aid station. But I knew that he was not far behind and that like he can close. He has done these a million times and I never count Jon out basically. And then we got to the final crew aid station at mile 62. And as I was leaving, Jon was coming in and I had just barely gotten around the corner when he came in and I could hear everybody going off. And so I knew that there was like less than a minute gap between us. And that definitely like lit a fire under me. Like I think for the next, what would that have been, like close to 20 miles, 18 miles or something. The entire time I was just looking back over my shoulder, waiting for Jon to be breathing down my neck because I knew you can never count him out. And he really did. Like he closed hard. I ended up growing the gap and putting a few minutes on, but he was definitely always in the equation.
And maybe they talked with you at the finish line about this, or you've just heard things kind of through the grapevine at this point, but how do you think they would have described you on race day? Like, how were you contributing to the group? How were you pressing them? What were you bringing to the dynamic?
I think I brought in some early pushing. Like we talked about how I led the race for the first 20 miles. I think that probably brought the whole group along faster than people would have gone out. I also think that sometimes when I felt really good jogging the kind of grade that most of those climbs were, while sometimes they would go back down into a hike and my jog was slightly faster than their hike. So we would have like this funny tortoise in the hare kind of dynamic where I would catch up. They wouldn't like me kind of being right on their shoulders. So then they'd take off running, put a gap on, and then I'd slowly reel back in. And I think that also contributed to keeping the pace hot. I actually had lots of like positive thoughts during the race about like how cool it is to be running with these guys, how much I was just like loving their company and the like vibe that we had as that pack of three together. And I actually kept a lot of it to myself because I was like, if I share how like much I appreciate these guys and like how awesome this is right now, it's gonna make them feel good. And I got to keep this to myself and just like hoard the positive energy because I don't want to boost them up so much that they end up just dropping me. But I mean, I really appreciated what they were doing. And I think that feeling was all mutual. I think we were all feeling really grateful for each other.
I can't share any positivity.
I cracked a few times and had to give him some praise, but I tried to keep the praise then.
This is another thing. And this is another thing that I'm curious about. An example is from Black Canyon. Seth Ruling was talking about this in his race recap on the Boulder Boys show about how early on in the race, and again, this is a way different race than Transgrancanaria, but like as soon as it started to get hot, he was being pretty proactive and he was doing a lot of topical cooling. He was really taking care of himself. This is Transgrancanaria is a race where, yeah, you start in the dark, but like as soon as the sun rises, you're pretty exposed. Can you talk about like those dynamics, like if and whether you were taking care of yourself and if you noticed Jon and Josh around you taking it just as seriously?
I didn't really ever see what Jon and Josh were doing during aid station stops because I was just focused on what I was doing. But I was, as soon as the sun came up and it got hot, I was doing like dousing myself with water. I had an ice bandana, and I actually, before the race, I wasn't going to use it because it's so hard to find ice and a cooler out in Europe. It seems like you have to. I think Morgan probably went to, I don't know, 4 or 5 different supermarkets trying to figure out how to say cooler in Spanish and find one that would hold enough ice and stay cold enough that it would actually last for the next 12, 14 hours. But that was huge. I'm so glad that she put in the effort to get ice because I was the only one I saw out there using ice. It seems like it's not a very prevalent thing in Europe, but that was massive because it really was, even if it's only 70 degrees and hot and sunny, it's kind of humid and we're coming from training in 15, 20 degree weather. So that's a huge temperature swing and it felt really hot. And yeah, I think taking care of myself in that way, just staying on top of cooling prevented more serious like dehydration because also being in the Mountain West throughout the winter, it's hard to get your stomach used to taking in enough water because you just don't sweat that much training here. And then you go to those climates where suddenly you require a ton more water to stay hydrated and it's hard for your stomach to handle all that. So keeping yourself cool really makes a difference and makes it so you don't need to, your stomach doesn't need to be able to process quite the same amount of liquid.
Our European audience is going to laugh at us because this is probably self-evident to them or obvious. And I only found this, by the way, like 5 hours before the race because, again, we were in the same boat as you, looking for ice, looking for coolers. I ended up finding this sports chain store called Decathlon, which is, I think it's like the equivalent of Sports Authority or Dick's or whatever you would use here in the States. And they ended up having stuff. So I guess for Americans that want to go over, if you're inspired by what Caleb did and you're looking to get all this gear, if you don't bring it yourself, go to Decathlon. They've got it. But yeah, that's wild. So do you think, again, because there is a lot of really interesting stuff to discuss from like Tejeda onward, but prior to Tejeda, do you feel like you were burning any matches or writing any kind of like figurative checks that you couldn't cash? Or was anyone in that pack doing what you thought might have been that? Or did it feel pretty controlled for the most part?
The first 20 miles, I felt like I was burning matches at a quicker rate than I could maintain, which is why I dialed that back. And then until Tejeda, that's like another 30 miles later. During that whole time, I feel like Josh was probably the one setting the pace the most. And I think Jon and I both felt decent. I guess I can't speak for Jon, but I felt decent. And like it was not pushing beyond what I was confident I could hold. It wasn't until after Tejeda that I really felt like I was taking some risks and doing something that might be unsustainable.
Okay. How about, I want to talk quickly too about any in-race mantras or thought processes that you had in this section. Like in your Substack, you talk about playing to win. And I know we have covered sort of your mindset heading in, but can you talk about how, you know, that was staying top of mind for you early on and midway through?
Yeah, I started having that thought when I was leading the race early on because I thought maybe this is stupid and I'm gonna blow up and end up dropping way back. And I was thinking like I have done this enough times now where I know that for a race like this, I can pretty confident like something would have to go terribly wrong for not me to not be top 10. And I even thought like I probably got a top 5 in me if I just run a easy conservative race and work my way up. Like I felt really good about being able to do that. And I've done this enough times now where I was ready for something different and like I wanted to take some risks and see if I really could do something special. I I think I had gotten some encouragement before from like Anthony Costales, Tyler had said something similar. Leah had messaged me, but basically the recurring theme in all these messages I got was just like, you belong at the front. Like, don't be afraid to be up there and take some chances. And so I was thinking like, I want to play this one to win. I don't want to play it safe. I want to take some risks. And if that ends up not working for me, at least I played to win. And that's a fun way to try racing. So yeah, that was kind of a mantra that was like going through my head that first maybe 50 or so miles.
That's so interesting because there are absolutely people in the sport, and again, no discredit to them because I think it's a cool way to exist. But there are people in the sport who have sort of made their living. They have staked out their position, being these predictable racers, and they know exactly what it takes to run inside the top 10. There's some people like Ian Sharman, for example, who built a career on being at Western States every year from like 2011 to 2021 or something like that. And I think it's interesting that, at least for you, you reach this point in the sport where maybe that predictability is unsatisfactory. And if you want to keep going in this sport, you need a new challenge. And again, there's like a lot of risk in that, but I think psychologically people might want to hear more of your thought process there because I mean, it's nice to know heading into a race that like you could stay under control and like have a result that most people on the outside looking in would be like, that's sick. That just further adds to Caleb's brand as this like dependable guy. But like apparently that's not enough.
Well, that's kind of what I did at Western States, and like the variable or the unpredictability of Western States was that it was my first time doing a 100 miler, and I didn't know how that would feel. So that was like how I justified just running conservative and working my way up slowly and ending up in fifth. And that was still new and exciting because it was the farthest I'd ever gone. But for this one, it was still a really long distance. That was my second longest run ever, but I knew I could go the distance. I was feeling pretty fit. And I think I was also inspired post CCC to not have that feeling again because CCC was so far in the other direction of like, I knew that on a decent day, I should be able to get top 10 at CCC. I ended up 12th and I just felt like flat and dead and still not recovered from Western States from the beginning of that race. And it was like some people would be stoked about 12th at CCC. I would have been in a previous
I
year.
remember.
Yeah, I got 13th 2 years before, and that was my greatest day ever. I thought it was amazing. And you just kind of like reset expectations for yourself, and the bar gets higher. And so you get less stoked about things that would have before made you really happy. I guess it's sort of like this like dopamine hit addiction where it takes more and more to make it feel as good as it did before. And yeah, I didn't want a repeat of like a CCC kind of thing where I just felt like I had a fine day and played it safe and it was all right, but didn't hit the bar that I'd set for myself. So I set a much higher bar for this one and went for it. And yeah, that was a very exciting way to do it.
I still think that's exceptional. I I think that yes, there like for all of us, like we are trying to get better and achieve personal growth. But I would argue that at a certain level, especially when you get to like your realm of excellence in ultra running, I don't think the bar always gets higher. I think a lot of people are stoked to settle, you know? So maybe that's what separates, maybe that's one of the variables that separates the greats and why I now consider you to be sort of in that superstar realm. But, and it's fascinating. Talk about the moment that you separated from, like, walk us through that moment out of Tejeda, where you separate from Josh, because I was talking with, or I remember hearing Mike talk about this, Mike McMonagle. He kind of predicted that if you were going to break away, or when you would break away, it would be getting sort of safely to Garanon with people like Albon and Josh. And you're just such a monster downhiller that, like, if you have the energy, that's where you're going to separate. But you do sort of make that penultimate move coming out of Tejeda, which is brutal. So talk about that.
So at that point, we already had a little bit of space on Jon. So it was me and Josh together. And I had thought the same thing going into the race, like in that Substack post with like my plan. I think I had said I'd like to get to the top El Garonion basically with the lead pack and then make my move on the downhill. So that was what I was thinking I would probably do. But I ended up going out of Tejeda. We were doing this climb and Josh had just been right. Either I had been right on his tail or he had been right on my tail. Like there had been less than like 10 feet of separation between us for hours. And I had been leading for a couple minutes and I thought I heard him like kind of stumble, like, you know, that noise that you hear when your foot scuffs the ground really hard. I looked back and kind of expected to see him like laid out on the ground, but he was fine. He was standing up, he was hiking. But I started jogging, and usually whenever I started jogging, he would match me and also jog right behind me. But this time he kept hiking. And so I started slowly pulling away. And I hit a little switchback and like checked back. And for the first time in hours, there was maybe like 30 feet between us, like still just a few seconds, not a huge gap. But I was like, I don't know, something's different this time. I'm going to try pushing for a minute and see if he stays with me, because in the past he always had. And I just kind of took off. The trail flattened out for a second. Somebody actually got a video of this, which was kind of cool because I looked back and it confirmed what I thought was happening just based on what I was hearing. But yeah, I put the gas on for a minute, got around a corner right as he hit the top. And then from there on out, it was just, I figured if I could get around corners before he came around, he wouldn't see me and he would think that I was way ahead, and that would maybe break him mentally a bit. So I kept the gas on for basically that whole climb up the next like 3 miles. I was just trying to run as much of it as I could. And by the time I got to the top, I had a few minutes. That was the last time I saw anybody pretty much the whole race, except like when I said Jon was getting close at the last aid station. But yeah, it was the last time I was with anybody.
I love this competitive mindset. And you talked about it in your recap about the importance of taking advantage of moments of weakness. And you kind of mentioned earlier in the conversation too, with, you know, maybe not wanting to be too positive and giving people sort of free energy. But I'm just blown away that this late in the race, you're not simply surviving, but you are fit enough and in a good enough headspace to be able to focus outward and to be sort of cognizant of what he's doing and knowing that, like, it's earlier than expected, but this is your time to go.
I think that's where the difference between like previous versions of myself and now, I think the difference there was like fitness. Like I don't think I'd ever gotten that deep into a race feeling that good and like I still had matches left to burn as I did in that moment. And I think if training hasn't been going as well, or you're not doing all the little things to get your legs as strong as you can, then you can't do that and you're in more of the survival mentality. And this was the first time where I was at that point where I thought I'm keeping pace with the leader and it feels okay. And I feel like I could push anytime if I needed to.
Is this where the break the elastic mantra comes into play too?
Yeah, that was that moment. The whole climb up El Garonion, I was just telling myself, like, there's been this elastic holding me and Josh together for the past several hours. If I don't snap it right now and he ends up closing back down, then we're going to be stuck together for the rest of the day, and I'm going to have to do it later, and that's going to hurt more later. So I figured put in the extra effort now and save yourself some effort later.
We'll try to link to the video in the show notes. TGC put out a couple cool recap vids, but in the one that I think you're referencing where they catch the trip and you just sort of like look back briefly and keep going, I'm blown away by how like close together you guys are. And I mean, he is sitting right on top of you, like breathing. It is like the definition textbook of breathing down your neck and not giving you an inch.
Yeah, I mean, that's how it had been all day. It wasn't annoying or anything. Like I had been like that too on him. I think that's what I mean by there was an elastic. Like we were together. We could not have been more together. And a lot of the time that trail was like two people wide and we were shoulder to shoulder. Like it was neck and neck for a long time. So that's why it felt like such a big deal to have that 30 feet of space, and it felt like a big gap.
This might be a European thing, and I don't know if you really had the chance to experience it in this race because there was just three of you, and maybe you got to know each other. I was having a totally different race, you know, 20, 30 places back. But even at that level of the race, one thing that caught my attention was how present or how aware the people in front of you are of you coming up. And so, for example, on a climb coming out of Terror, for example, like there would be a lot of real estate between the runner in front of me and this whole space to the left where you could pass.
Yeah.
And as soon as they noticed me coming up, they would take a really sharp right angle to block it.
Oh yeah.
And then I would make a move to my right to just take, I'm like, oh, they just made a mistake. Like they're not paying attention. So I'd go to my right to take a different right, and they would cover it. And you would really have to like want to pass and like go off trailing around to make it happen. And I was just laughing because I'm like, this has to be a European thing, because in America, I think it's more fraternal, and it's like, you know, at least for me, like if I saw someone coming from 5 or 10 feet away, I would like almost get off trail and like, like a clown. But people are covering moves at like 28th place in the race, and it made me chuckle.
It did feel a little more fraternal for like the squad that we had up front. I think there was, if any of us had wanted to get past, we wouldn't have blocked each other. And like that, Morgan actually just reminded me, there was a funny moment where Josh and I had just pulled ahead of John. We were doing some downhill into Tejeda, and Josh said something like, dude, I got to pee so bad. And I was like, oh, I actually do too. And he's like, do you want to stop and pee? And I was like, actually, I don't have to go that bad. Like, I'm going to keep going. But you stop and pee if you want. And he knew that, like, even though we were kind of buddies, we were together, he was so worried about me dropping him if he stopped for a second to pee that he was like, oh, no, I'll wait. And then when I saw that he was also waiting, I was like, who cares? I'll stop and pee with you. I don't care. And so we took a minute, both stopped and peed together, and then took off together again. But it did feel more fraternal.
Even that is a negotiation. That's wild.
Yeah. I know. I've never had like a verbal like agreement to stop and pee together.
I'll go if you go.
Like yeah, no, that's exactly what it was.
This is another thing that I think, again, like I mentioned earlier, how like one of the things that's so clear to me about this experience, not just for you, but for Josh and Jon as well, is you guys are so fit that you can almost like have this out of body experience and just be totally present with like just the competition of it all. Like it's not a woe is me thing. You're not just surviving and you happen to be in third place. Like there is psychology, there's game planning going on, etc. And I think like with those last 16 to 20 miles, I have to imagine to some extent there are these like psychological hurdles and the wheels are falling off. Maybe your stomach is rebelling, your legs. Can you talk about, like, just based on the experience you've had now, 3 years racing at a pretty high level, is there always going to be a point in the race where like those systems fail and you have to kind of will yourself to keep going? Or have you had those races, and maybe TGC was one of them, where it's like there's not really that much self-talk that has to happen, like I prepared for this, everything is working, it's fairly smooth sailing?
I've had those races, but they're usually the ones that I feel more disappointed about because I feel like I didn't get the most out of myself. Like, I think if you, like, I mean, it's like what you tell people who aren't really, like, you'll get comments from coworkers and stuff who are like, well, I don't even want to drive 50 miles or whatever. Like, people who can't even imagine, like, running for X amount of time on end. And, like, the fitter you get, it doesn't get easier. You just can push harder. maybe it gets easier in that you don't have to do it for as long, but there's a, I think you can only really feel, I can only really feel satisfied with myself if I get to the point where things are starting to fall apart at the end, because then I know like I didn't have that much more to give. And if I get to the end and I still feel like everything's held together well, then usually I'm like, oh, I should have pushed earlier, harder. And I do think I've had some races that have felt like that at the end. But yeah, they're often the ones where I'm slightly disappointed with not having pushed harder.
And you felt like even though you ran a course record, you win the race. Was there any question that you could have pushed harder, or like was everything laid out there?
I think that probably if someone had actually been like within 30 seconds and I was getting peaks of them every time I looked back, I probably could have found a little harder to push, but not much. Like that was pretty close to as hard as I could have gone. And I did feel little things creeping up of like, like the very starts of cramps and dehydration. And I felt like if that had been too much longer, things would have fallen apart.
Okay. I want to talk quickly about the course before we get to the end. You said earlier that it actually surprised you how much more runnable this was than maybe you were anticipating in training. Generally speaking, in retrospect, what do you think makes this course challenging, a beast? Outside of the competitive aspect of it, like what you need to get ready for.
Yeah, so I think there aren't that many races that have as much vertical elevation gain as Transgrancanaria, while also being like semi-runnable. There were sections of that where you could get into a low, grindy uphill running gear and knock it out, but also sections where you were forced into a hike. There's a lot of technicality and like rocks on the course, so you're constantly navigating that. There's actually a ton of paved sections too, and in a way that was nice because it was a break from the technicality, but also it was like pounding pretty hard. It seemed like everywhere that it was paved, it was almost steeper than the trail, and it was like pretty hard on the legs and joints and stuff coming from running mostly on snow here. So I think those all make the course challenging, but what makes it the most like appealing and intriguing is probably just like the aesthetic line that it draws down the middle of the island, going from point to point, north to south on the island, and also like having so much of that be on these ridges above these cities with these like cool rock formations. You get an awesome sunrise. Just all of those factors of like the beauty of the course, I think made it super appealing. And then add in like the international competition that it draws each year. It's kind of a perfect early season race, I think.
Again, if we can link to this in the show notes, we will. But I caught your finish somewhere over Instagram, and you're doing a celebration that I've never seen before. Talk about that celebration.
I had seen it before. I had seen some tennis people do it before. I think some like cyclists have done it, but I I don't know that a ton of like meaning needs to be assigned to it because I just kind of like did what I was feeling in the moment. But I do think like I had this internal dialogue going on for hours of just trying to convince myself to keep pushing, convince myself that even though I was hurting, it was okay. It was good to hurt. And I think that that was kind of my celebration of like, all right, it's all over. Like conversation ended. I don't need to keep talking to myself anymore. I'm done with this.
So for people that didn't see it, you're holding a mobile phone up to your face, and as you cross the finish line, you're closing. You're putting the phone down.
I'm hanging up the conversation.
Okay, and that's just it's just symbolic to yourself. It's like I've been negotiating with myself for the last few hours. We did it.
If we want to try to make it mean something, then yeah, that's what it was.
I just thought it was cool. I had never seen it before. I thought you were going to be like the Gritty or something.
Yeah, maybe next time.
You wrote a great post about anti-doping in the sport, and did any of this happen at TGC? Like, what's your finish line experience?
No. So yeah, you finish, come across the line. I was expecting to be handed a sealed water bottle usually that's what the anti-doping officials will do. They'll give you like an option of several different water bottles you choose. You start rehydrating, you get ready to pee. I specifically hadn't peed for like 20 miles leading up to that point because I was like, if I can just like pee and get it over with quickly, then I can go home sooner. So I'm going to hold this in. And yeah, I crossed the line and did some interviews, hung out, got handed a open glass of water, which isn't what usually happens if you're going to be tested. And they never mentioned anything about testing. It was obvious that like it quickly became obvious that they weren't going to do any testing, which I think is insane. Like Transgrancanaria is a big race. It's part of the World Trail Majors series. There's significant money on the line. And like for the race like that to not do any sort of anti-doping control, I actually think really like emphasizes kind of what I was writing about. Like there are still some huge strides that we need to take in this sport in order to professionalize it. And like someone could have been doping that entire time. You could have gone into a crew station, gotten an injection, and like no one would ever have caught that unless they saw it at the aid station, I guess. But like it's insane that we're still not at the point where at least the podium gets tested immediately after a race like that.
Yeah. People should go check out your post. Because what was the book you read? It was the cyclist on Lance's team.
Yeah, it was oh man, what was it called? The something race? The
longest race? Is it the longest race?
secret race? It was the secret race.
The secret race, okay.
Yeah. But yeah, it was about kind of the doping culture in cycling in the early 2000s, especially surrounding like Lance Armstrong.
And like just how easy it was.
And they also mentioned how prevalent it is in Spain and like how that was one of the countries where they would go to get their supply. So like, I don't know, it's funny that we're 25 years later and I don't know that means anything, but in a Spanish country, they're still not drug testing after some of these long endurance events.
Hopefully, even 2 or 3 years from now, that like what we're describing here is a totally outdated conversation, and there'd be shock value in not having testing at the end of a World Trail Major. But okay, a few more questions before we close up. I think the first, we talked earlier about how you've made this transition from being like a reliable top 10, top 5 ultra runner to I'm going to test out this theory that, I can be a regular podium guy. I can win these races. At this point, like you kind of like get to that place pretty quickly, right? It's like Transgrancanaria, boom, got it done. Like with the rest of your season, does this feel like a less unpredictable, less unknown space, or is the world of podium and winning so much different from, top 10, top 5 that you kind of still have this novelty and fear factor going into each one?
I think definitely still novelty and fear factor. Like I think this race was great. It's another notch in the like confidence boosting pole, but I don't think it at all means that like, oh, now I feel like I can go win Western States. Like I think there's still huge question marks. Every style of race is so different. There's different levels of competition. Like I don't think anyone's going to argue that Transgrancanaria is on the same level of competition as some of these big races like Western States or UTMB or CCC. And so there's still a ton of question marks around that sort of thing. But it does give me the hope that like it's not completely out of the question. And like where last year maybe I thought top 10 at Western States would be awesome. Now maybe I'm thinking like podium would be awesome. Like it just kind of moves the bar up higher and makes me excited to take on higher levels of competition where I can continue like I guess proving myself against some of the best out there, because now I'm starting to think of myself as like able to actually contend with some of them.
It could be for any reason, but was this, and we're also only a few days removed, but do you feel like this was the most important race of your career to date, or was there another one that had significance for bigger reasons?
There are a bunch that have been significant for different reasons. Like Worlds in 2023 was really significant because that was a eye opener of the level of competition that's out there and how much I had to work on, and really gave me some clear things of like, I need to figure this out if I'm ever going to do well at one of these. Western States was super important because that gave me the confidence that I'm decent at this stuff, I guess. Like I I think every one of these results builds on the last, and you're still going to have some bad days in there eventually. But the ones where things go well stick out and build on each other. And I think this is another step along that ladder.
I'm trying to think of how to phrase this. It kind of goes back to everything we've been saying the last few minutes, but is there a world where you could retreat back to being this middle to back of the pack front runner, or does this victory like totally change your self-perception and there's just like this, even if it's just internal, this expectation that like I'm only lining up at these races to be a front runner, to dictate, to set the tone, or to be in the mix with whoever is there at the front with me?
There's definitely still a world where I will not be leading the race early on.
That's interesting.
I mean, there's going to be some really fit people at Western States, for example, that take it out really hot. And I think even though I'm feeling good, there's still like an obvious threshold that you can cross where all the alarms are going off in your brain of this is not sustainable. This is going to put you in the hole and you won't be able to recover. So if that happens, when that happens, because that will happen at races like Western States or highly competitive races, I can easily still see myself backing off, maybe sitting back half of top 10 and working my way up.
Gotcha.
But I think that hopefully now I'll be able to work my way up farther.
So you're leaving a lot of room for flexibility. It just depends on the race, the environment.
Yeah, I mean, look at like Hayden last year, podiumed Western States. He's a super fit dude. He didn't front run. He worked his way up and like picked off a ton of people. Like it definitely can still put you in an awesome position. And I don't think you need to do that to yourself of like being in the mix the entire race at the very front in order to still do really well and get the most out of yourself. So I think playing it by ear and just doing that when it feels right is what works for me.
We're talking a lot about Western States here. Of course, last year you had the fastest debut in the sport's history, and it was 14:40 and change, and it was only good for top 5, which is insane. Are you talking about it because it's likely you're going back? Like, what's coming off TGC? What do the next 4 to 6 months look like for you?
Yeah, we're talking about it because it's the next really big one that I would like to try to do that is getting me excited. I'm signed up for Gorge. Morgan is due with our baby 2 weeks later after Gorge, and it's also only like 7 weeks from now, 8 weeks from now. And like that just I can only make myself hurt like that a few times a year. And with the schedule that I currently have in my mind, turning that around and being able to have a great race at Gorge seems hard. And it also seems like it would compromise any chance I'd have of doing that again at Western States another 8 weeks later. Like it kind of feels like I maybe need to pick between Gorge and Western States. And if there's a good chance that I could make the world's team off of a resume spot, because I do feel like my resume is getting stronger, then I would love to be able to save all the energy and focus and training for a race like Western States. But I also would love to make the world's team. And if doing Gorge is what that takes, then that's probably what I'll do. But I don't know. Right now, it's just hard immediately post race to like think about what I'm actually going to do next. And I guess I got a lot of ideas floating around and a lot of uncertainty because of our baby being born. So we'll see exactly what that looks like. I am not super committed to anything right now.
I think it's really interesting what you said there about like, I only have the opportunity to go this deep so many times a year. I guess that's different for some people. It can be anywhere from, depending on who you are, 2 to 7 or 8 times a year. Is there a world where, and again, this is a super hypothetical, but is there a world where you do get a resume spot, you don't have to run Gorge, and maybe you clear the deck for Worlds and don't even do Western? Or is Western something that like you're really keen on regardless?
There's a world where I don't race again until the World Championship race in September. I think if someone gave me like the assurance that I was going to make the world's team, then I probably wouldn't do gorge. If having a baby is really hard and having a 6-week-old doesn't make sense to go out and race Western States, then I would not do it. And so then the next one on the calendar would be the world's team.
Yeah. Before we go, we got to get you mentioned Morgan. I think we owe Morgan a shout out, like especially from a crewing standpoint. 2 questions here before we go. 1, can you get into some detail about the difficulties of crewing Transgrancanaria, and then B, sort of someone like Morgan rising to the occasion to facilitate this type of win?
Yeah, when we were planning this out, we had a lot of friends going out to Transgrancanaria. And for various reasons, about half the friends that we thought were going to go out ended up out there, which was awesome. It was super fun to hang out with them. And it also meant that Morgan was by herself all night. So that race starts at midnight. Morgan is driving our car across the entire island. There's 7 different crew points, and I was going quick, so you're kind of hurrying to each one. The roads are super steep, windy, lots of blind corners. It's 3 a.m. Morgan's tired. She's 7 months pregnant. And like, I think she, like, the amount of respect and importance of like my success that Morgan's role played in that was pretty insane. Like, I think there's no possible way that that day was going to happen if she hadn't been there. Even if I had had somebody else like stand in or take a shift and she had done every other aid station or something, like she has crewed for me so many times at this point that she knows me really well. She knows how I'm like, when I come into an aid station, she can read my face. She knows what I need. She knows what to tell me. And she's also good at adjusting. Like, she's been around the precision guys so much that she's learned a lot from them. And she's good at adjusting my nutrition plan on the go, depending on how the wrappers that I've given her from the previous aid station looked. She might throw in like an extra gel or something. And I think there's no one else that I would have trusted to do that job besides her.
Amen. Awesome, man. Yeah. I, first and foremost, as a friend, it's been no surprise, but it's still been fun to watch your continued trajectory in the sport. And this is, to me, it's a big step, but it's still just another notch. And it was also cool to see in that Substack that you feel like it's probably not the end. Like, there's still a lot of room for growth. And I almost wish the audience could be a fly on the wall of that Jack Kuenzle conversation later today or tomorrow, whenever it happens. But yeah, I guess we'll be watching eagerly in the next few weeks to see how things unfold. And if I could get a little political for a second and throw an idea out into the ultrasphere, if I was a voter on this world's team thing, I would absolutely allow you to bypass Gorge and rightfully earn a resume spot on the team. To me, it's, especially if you're looking at recency, like recent results extending back to Western last year and where you're headed, I think it's obvious. So
thanks, man. But I don't think you sound like you're trying to wrap this up. And I feel like before we wrap up, you got to give a little recap of your experience out there, because I think so much of this training block for this was like inspired by this shared drive that me, you, Mike, other friends all shared to train and do well at this race. And I know that you didn't have exactly the day you wanted, but I also feel like you're someone who's always able to take great lessons out of however the experience ends up playing out. And I think people would love to get a quick little takeaway from you.
All right, I appreciate you. Yeah, a couple things that come to mind. First, this sport is very difficult, and for most people, I think it's very unpredictable, which I think is what makes people like you so impressive, that with regularity, you can turn in good results. And it's almost an extreme exception to the rule that you have a bad day. Like you mentioned CCC last year being frustrating, Worlds the year before that. But by and large, it's really easy to bet on you. And you're one of a few people that is easy to bet on. So I think the experience reaffirmed to me just how unpredictable things are. I had the best training block of my life. And I think historically, although this is changing because, you and I did a lot of workouts together and lead up, I am increasingly unable to keep up with you on workouts. So that's changing. But historically, I've been able to do the training with people of maybe your former caliber, but still in that professional scene. And I have not had a race that has gone well. So to me, it's still a mystery. I think the other lesson is just extreme accountability. So I don't pin it on anything except for my own failings. And whether it's going back to the drawing board on pacing or nutrition or mindset, whatever, I got stuff to work on. I think the big thing going into this was just proving to myself that I could do a full training block and show up for workouts and long runs each week. And I kind of checked those boxes, and that was a fun breakthrough because I haven't always also done the work necessary in the lead up. And I think now I got to look maybe under the hood more on nutrition and race day execution and see where I can improve there. Because yeah, I mean, maybe Brett and I will talk about it briefly on a future long run archives, but I was pretty much out of it from like the very first aid station, like mile 7 onward. I was trying to kind of fake it till I made it after that, but things were unraveling pretty quickly and I wasn't pushing that hard. At least I didn't think I was. So I don't know. It's a mystery, but
seeing your training, I think that looked like the fittest you've ever been. And to not be able to put that fully to use on race day, like I know is frustrating, but I do think it's going to be really cool seeing how that kind of base fitness sets you up for some of your really long goals that you've got, like Cocodona or Mammoth later in the year. I think that's going to put you in such a good position. And I also think that as someone who is about to have a kid and watching you and Jules manage your kid out there, I think it was really cool to see that you still can travel out to these international races. You can still put in the training that it takes to get a good result. And even if the day doesn't work out exactly how you want it to, like being able to pull off a trip like that and seeing that it's possible, even though it did not always look very easy, it definitely gives me faith that I'm going to be able to continue on after we have this next step of our life.
Oh man, I appreciate that so much. And I'll say one more thing. And I think one of the cool things about being in Salt Lake, and maybe you feel this too, although again, you're getting increasingly into this rare air where there's only a few people in the community that are at your level, but it is fun for me as someone that would love to arrive at a better version of myself. It is so fun to kind of on a whim on any given day, insert yourself into the mix with people that are way better than you. And it gives you a really good forecast of what's possible on race day. Like even if I'm getting just destroyed by you, like there's a YouTube vlog where it's like you, me, and Mike on a workout and we're going up Van Cott and you're so far ahead of us. It's so evident, like on the stuff that matters, you're so far ahead. At the very least, you have this barometer of what's possible on race day. And so I like one of the things that I'm looking forward to as soon as you're ready to get back into it is like getting back in the mix with you and like continuing to test. And who knows if it ever comes together, but I love showing up, in between races. It's a lot of fun.
That is a lot of fun. We've got so many people that like specialize in different aspects of racing that if you ever want to run fast, you know who to call. If you ever want to go hike hard, you know who to call. And like there is the right person to push you in any given discipline. And everybody is on these schedules where like if it's a down day or whatever, if you just want to go knock out a long run and you don't care what pace you're going at, you can always get a huge group going. And that's so fun to be able to do that together.
Well, I think we should sign off here. Obviously, always great chatting with you. Love following your success. We've mentioned it quite a bit. We'll link to it in the show notes. Go check out Caleb's Substack, Chasing Trail. I mean, I've been a subscriber since the beginning, but I think it's gotten better with each report. I'm excited for the next one to come out. And we'll also try to link to some of that race footage, kind of showing Caleb mixing it up with Jon and Josh through the middle of the race. Appreciate the time, man. Excited to see what happens next. And thanks for letting me indulge in my failures too. That was fun.
All right. Yeah. Thanks for having me on. That was a great trip.